time to go time. You're all really welcome, and thank you to all of you who have made the journey down, because I think most of you have come from the northwest. It's a very intimate affair, and it marks the end of Mark's exhibition, Songs on the Soil, and also Resonant Landscapes, where Mark invited 3 artists, and I'm so delighted that you're all here today. Sharon, Porrig and Natalia, with whom I know Mark has collaborated with in the past, and it was a lovely way to kind of round the whole thing up for us here in the gallery. It is also to mark the launch of Austin McQuinn's book, Becoming Audible, which has been published by Penn State University. While COVID and the attendant restrictions has been really hard, there have been some fruitful opportunities. And when we were in lockdown here, Siobhan and myself and Sarah and other members of the team, we started to think a little bit about how we could maybe repurpose some of the spaces. And one of the things that we decided to do was to open up the upper floor galleries. And immediately Mark seized upon the idea of, oh great, that's a fantastic idea. I know 3 artists that I'd really like to, curate a show of. And he did that, and it has been fantastic. Mark also managed to do something else, which was to what I refer to in the past as the 4th plinth, thanks to my brother Charlie, who's also here in the audience, and created one of these fantastic thread sequences. And for those of you who may be interested in visitor numbers, we've had about 15,000 visitors since the exhibition opened at the end of September. And that, is pretty good. We're keeping our head above water. I'm also delighted that Carl Dorn is here. Carl is another bit of our experiment that's going on, and we invited him as our first artist in residence, and Carl has taken over another one of the galleries upstairs as a studio space for a period of 8 weeks. So do afterwards, please feel free to go up and have a look around. Carl will be delighted to talk to you, I imagine. I mentioned that these were hard times, and this time last year we would have launched an exhibition called Animals and Imagination, which was curated by Austin and had been about 3.5 years in the making. We were so looking forward to it, 15 international and Irish artists looking at a world that I personally don't know a lot about, or an area, but is obviously very important in academia and also within the visual arts. So it was just a sense of pride, really, that kind of propelled all of this, and we worked, Austin worked really hard, and in fact, Porrig mentioned it to me today when he came in, did that exhibition, because you were involved in it as well, Porrig. It was probably the hardest decision I'd ever had to make, and that was to cancel the exhibition. It was the only exhibition that we had to cancel because we were able to work around the others, but we couldn't with this one. But anyway, we keep going on, and today I'm really thrilled in a nice sort of circular route that we're able to bring together both Austin and Mark to talk about their works, but in particular the work that so invigorates Austin and is the core of his book, Becoming Audible, as I mentioned before, and Mark and the work that you do, and the work and how sound and resonance, even in the titles of the exhibitions that you've put on here, it's so important. It permeates all of your work, and I think a lot of your thinking. So that's this kind of the story of the last 20 months in Limerick City Gallery of Art. Just maybe like to point out that there is a fabulous exhibition of photographs from our permanent collection, which my colleague Siobhan O'Reilly has installed over the last few days. So do just spend time there if you can this afternoon. Just going to say a few words about Austin and Mark. Austin is an artist and writer whose work has been shown in many international exhibitions, festivals and collections. In his studio practice based in County Tipperary, His most recent work is an exploration of energies he finds in devotional objects and mutating objects such as glaciers, mountains, molecules, cosmological events, and all mutating life, including ongoing bacterial lives active inside our own bodies, which is all very apposite for the moment. Austin McQuinn's book on creatureliness and resonance in arts and performance practice has received praise for its, quote, compelling array of contemporary artworks that explore animality alongside or at the limits of culture, end of quote. Becoming Audible explores in depth our relationship with animal life in culture, in performance and in sound, investigating animal presences in arts and performance practices, including living art, opera and radio broadcasts. The book opens and ends with the resonating sound of a whale. Mark, who will be known to most of you here, his practice is research-driven, and each body of work engages with a new form of conceptual criteria. Mark's practice is multifaceted and incorporates a variety of media, mechanisms, and material interests. In many instances, a number of these elements are combined in a singular exhibition situation to form installations. Driven by a fundamental interest in observing how humans navigate the world and the subjectivity inherent in these navigations. While located in research, the works prioritizes the poetic over the didactic, where research elements are subtly embedded and the works combine to enable an encounter that merges modesty and complexity. Mark has held exhibitions at museums and art venues in Europe and North America and represented Ireland at the 2005 Venice Biennale. Recent exhibitions finishing tomorrow include Songs on the Soil here at Limerick City Gallery of Art, the MAC Belfast, which originally commissioned the exhibition, and Chanwan Sculpture Biennale. I'm going to hand over to Mark and to Austin, but I would invite you, after the conversation, to ask questions, because I think that is something that, was one of the reasons why Austin was very, very keen that the 3 participating artists in Resident Landscapes would be here. So I'm really grateful that you are, and I hope you will participate. And I would also ask you to just linger a little while afterwards, because we will have some refreshments, if you feel like that. So...
Could I make a suggestion?
You may.
Is there a time limit?
I thought 40 minutes.
Perfect, okay. Because I'll definitely babble on if I'm not told.
40 minutes, and I will do that for you, Mark. I shall hold the baton.
Perfect,
in true Madame. So, to Austin, to Mark, a conversation. Thank you.
So Austin, maybe we could start with your book, if that's okay.
Sure.
So, I suppose it's a really fascinating read, and it's I suppose what the thing that really struck me about it was, why wasn't this written a long time ago? In terms of it's odd, in that it's odd that people do this in a way, but in the way that you structure the book, it's not odd at all. It seems like the most natural thing in the world that we would engage animals in this way as a kind of means of questioning them, but also questioning us as a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of what performativity is, what culture making is, and then the relationship between these two things that sort of exist in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love if you could just chat about it a little bit. If that was I know there's so much in the book that it's very difficult to have it's not a broad sweep in that sense. So I understand that, but maybe maybe even just a motivation for it might be whatever's the most interesting for you as a way to kind of speak about it.
Okay, well, just to use your own words, to question us as a thing, I think is a good place to start.
Sure.
It's at questioning, human place in the world, our relationship to other living creatures. I'm a mammal, male mammal, middle-aged, and I use the term animal more over, say, non-human animal or other than human, which are, there's many different terms, but I just use animal to not to distinguish, but I suppose the word human to distinguish us from other animals.
Sure.
My interest, so the question, I suppose, asked is, what is the book about? Which is a very difficult question to answer in a way, because it is very broad scope. It's very broadly about, it's essentially really about art, I think. That's my interest. I'm not a zoologist or an anthrozoologist even. I know as much as anyone else about animals, really, I think. But I am curious about where artists use or try to connect with creatureliness as a means of expression for their ideas and my own ideas. Beginnings of the research came out of my own practice, I suppose. I was doing a project for Cork 2005. It's a long time ago, but Cork was the city of culture. And I guess I started asking the question, what was culture, and who has it, and who doesn't have it. And one of the main features in Cork City was the Opera House. But one of the houses that I'm really interested in any city I visit, is the Ape House. So there's no ape house in Cork. There's no zoo. And so I was playing with these questions, and I started looking into this question of animal cultures, and there's a belief, certain writers, that animals certainly have culture. We can accept that now. If culture is learned behavior, they have it. Okay. But again, my interest is in, well, what do we think about it? What are we doing with it? And I'm also very interested in sound, singing, opera particularly. I have a clip I might play.
Sure.
That might express, well, it would be, a generation will get this, another generation won't. I'll just play it, if I can pick it up.
Yeah.
Okay, so you know what that is.
I know what that is.
It's Johnny Weissmuller, Hollywood actor, as Tarzan. And in the very first Tarzan talking films, there was some representations of apes prior to that, in the very early days of cinema, but the first talking films, the talkies, were the Tarzan films. He made 10 films, and this was his call, Tarzan's call. And it was that particular recording, they say, that was used throughout then as the template for all Tarzan calls after that. So what's interesting to me in this is, as an example, he's not imitating an animal. He's not imitating an ape. He's certainly not imitating human. He says that he kind of came up with the call because of German yodeling neighbors he had in the Hollywood Hills as a child. And so it's an entirely human construction, is my point. But it is reaching into an animal acoustic territory. It's trying to reach across species boundaries into some other space of creatureliness, of maybe also a kind of freedom, I would say, is a theme that runs through the book, where animals and animal sounds and voices have been used as paths to freedom from the human boundaries. So, we will talk about birds, I hope, half the book is really about birdsong. The whole book could have been about birds. Birds as metaphor, birds as themselves, and that's the acoustic kind of soundtrack to our everyday world. But going back to Tarzan for a minute, I suppose I'm located there, as I say, as a kind of they're the closest species, to us, our cousins, and that sound became so iconic of something else outside of human acoustic worlds.
Yeah.
And that's what I think it is. It certainly, it just immediately brings me to somewhere that's primate and primal, and that's where I began this research. Was in my own question of our relationship as primates and our cultural concerns.
Yeah, it's really interesting in terms of the. I suppose the most interesting thing for me is because I'm aware of like a lot of the examples. So what does he call it with the piece with the bullfinches? Celeste Boissier Muñoz?
From here to ear.
From here to ear, yeah. So it's interesting because I think the thing that I really enjoyed about the book was a deep analysis actually of particular works, but then it's not just a deep analysis. They're located within a broader context of things that appear to use the same principles or use the same kind of parameters, basically. But yeah, so it was this kind of the relationship between things that you kind of structure. And it's an academic structure, but in a really useful sense. And it also, I suppose it kind of bridges time in lots of ways, in that you'll speak about a work from the 40s and then I'll speak about a contemporary work and about how there's similar things occurring in them. I know I'm still thinking birdsong. I should be thinking other things because we'll talk about birdsong later. But I think, I think that was, for me, what was really, really interesting about it. The deep analysis, but also then the shared value structures between works where you've observed them or they've been highlighted basically by the works. And so for me it was really interesting to revisit things I was familiar with, but the book kind of reveals a different depth to them, I suppose. But then also in terms of the way that you integrate like philosophical thinking, critical theory, but particularly it was kind of interesting. I was just chatting to you earlier, the idea of somebody who finally found a way to like actually instrumentalize the losing guitar in a really useful sense. Do you want to talk a little bit about them?
Yes, well, a colleague said to me that, philosophy, it's a tool, it's useful. They're ideas that people had, and they're there to be used. So it was a way of approaching something as dense and seemingly impenetrable, just the scale of it, of Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus. And you'll be familiar with the chapter that I refer to mostly as Becoming Animal.
Yeah.
But I suppose what interested me really was in Deleuze's own interest in Kafka, Franz Kafka, and how he found his way to his own ideas through Kafka. And Kafka found his roots to freedom through the animal body very often.
Yeah.
And also animal bodies that are vocalizing, the insect and the mouse that sings and so on. So from there, Deleuze takes this idea of animal becoming, which is a kind of a state of metamorphosis, maybe, to begin with, more than metaphor. I think that's where I tuned into their ideas, where they're not really interested in the animal as a metaphor for something. So that the lion is strength and the bee is industry, and they've no interest in that. They're interested in the activities of the animals and how we could sort of approach, say, creativity by thinking like they talk about the working like a rat, to think in the animal energies are other than human energies as routes into new territories of creative action. So rather than being at a distance from other than human persona and bodies, that we find a way through thinking into animality and out through it into something else.
Yeah, because I think that's sort of the key, in the sense that it's the books are really great art. Like they in a way for me are key in terms of when you as you go through the book, it reoccurs. This idea, some ideas of theirs reoccur basically, not in a sense that you outline it every single time they occur, but you're like, oh, that's interesting. It's like that's stemming from that position again. But what's interesting for me is your book almost could act as an analysis of that chapter, in the sense that it actually makes theoretical ideas concrete by kind of like placing them, locating them through different artworks, basically. And so in a way, for me, I got a much better understanding of that particular chapter from your book than I have from reading it without, because it occurs in an abstract sense, whereas the thing about your book is it almost could act as a reader for that chapter. Do you know what I mean?
Thank you. Well, they themselves consider, you know of some of the works I've been talking about.
Yeah.
So for me, the art comes first, and then for Deleuze and Guattari, art is primary.
Sure.
And for them, music is the primary art.
Sure.
And that they're trying to find their way through philosophy and thinking and ideas and psychoanalysis and schizoanalysis as methods of getting closer to Mozart. Yeah. So I'm glad that you found it useful in that way. For me, that was my ambition for the book, was that it would be useful.
Okay.
I really wrote it if I was a student, this is the book that I would want to read about this subject. That was my intention, and for that reason, it's as broad as my own interest, I suppose.
Sure. Sure. We actually made a menu of things we would discuss.
We did. Una suggested a menu.
Yeah.
So she did the starter.
How do you feel you've gotten?
There's no vegetarian option.
No. How do you feel you've gotten through the first course?
With just difficulty. I'd like to move on to the second course, which is representation and its problematics.
Yeah.
And horse and how we might digest that animal.
The horse.
Yeah.
Okay.
As you have represented so beautifully in your work.
Yeah.
But not without its own histories, I think.
For me?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, like horses were a big part of me sort of growing up. It was a big part of my life, I suppose. So, and I think this is the first time I've ever used them in an artwork, which is kind of interesting.
Okay.
But I suppose lots of what I do is to try and, with this particular project was the idea of, thinking about the earth as kind of a resonant space, basically. How we kind of reflect off that space. Sonically, in terms of like the sounds that occur in the world, but I guess socially, and how they're sort of intertwined. I was trying to think about how do I structure this, and I think about it as kind of forms of harmonized space, and I suppose that sort of occurs in different ways in the practice. Like the thread works are a kind of way to visually harmonize with a space, and then the idea of like, I guess, site specificity or responding to situations also kind of informs different kind of harmony between like yeah, between like a concept and a response, I suppose. Yeah, and like we were chatting about earlier, I suppose there's always kind of a merging of both the sonic and the social in terms of my interests. So there's something that I really like sonically, but I find it kind of quite difficult to detach from it socially. So if the kind of best musical kind of art for me is one that kind of merges both things, basically.
Okay.
That has like is exciting and dynamic in you know, from a kind of a tonal perspective, but also has some grounding or has some sort of function. And that was a lot of the thinking behind this exhibition, was trying to find places where those two things coexisted. Yeah, where the kind of sonic and social kind of married, I suppose.
What's the title of that piece, the horse work?
Unlock Shul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you describe? That was a process of finding sound to.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you want to talk about that work?
Yeah. Just the process, really, of how it arrived to this point.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it both existed within the whole broader context of things, but also kind of as an individual thing.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah, part of research I was doing about the relationship between landscape, social landscape, and like pictorial landscape, sonic landscape, and and kind of looking at how those three sort of things coexist. And then I got approached to make to basically work on a public artwork, a Percent for Art scheme for a halting site in North Roscommon, basically.
A commission.
A commission, essentially, yeah. So I went and met with that community a couple of times, and it actually wasn't a brilliantly fruitful process in lots of ways, and quite complex process. So I was left in this kind of complex situation where I tried to give the money back, where I was like, oh, this isn't going to work. The idea I had in my head isn't actually going to work as a thing. And it was kind of too late. It had almost been signed off on. So, and they had it was sort of tricky. So so I started thinking about maybe there's some sort of value in responding to that social situation. So, so I set about writing a text initially, which looked at the kind of evolution of the relationship between settled and traveller communities. I guess mainly at the early start of the century, which is where it's more dynamic in terms of there's a transformation from quite a positive, fluid situation to something that's very broken, basically. And so I tried to kind of look at that particular juncture, basically, between the state and two different forms of peoples that are coexisting on a land, and the kind of complexity of that. And so I wrote a very dogmatic piece initially, and then pared away at it to try and make it more kind of poetic or a little bit more subjective, basically, and kind of use the structure of a Greek tragedy again. So the idea of something that didn't have a Hollywood ending, something that could be tragic but also be open-ended. Use that kind of as a format to write a piece. And then met with a traveller, and he translated a lot of it for me and sang some parts for me. And then it was a long kind of process of, I wrote some musical structures, and then there's a collaborator, Sean Carpio, who I work with quite a lot, and he and I basically then got together quite quickly for like a weekend, and kind of wrote the rest of the music and song around the piece.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it became, I suppose, a way for a lot of the other ideas for the exhibition to build around in a way, but there was things happening simultaneously anyway, as a work. And then Porrick and I went and shot every in that kind of magic hour, for like, I don't know, 10 or 20 evenings, basically. We shot these two horses that that were kind of interesting in that they look really similar, but they're not quite identical. So this idea of two things kind of coexisting on the earth as a work. So Yeah, and then so the song is half sung in cant or gammon and then half in English, basically. So it's kind of a structured confusion, I suppose, which kind of points to the way the state kind of enabled a kind of a confusion about these people. And a lot of the research kind of became around those kind of situations, quite rural situations actually, rather than urban situations where people kind of respond to, the land in a very, very broad sense, basically.
Except it's not neutral. There's no neutrality.
No.
I think, it's very beautiful to look at, and it's very lyrical to me, but I quite quickly understood there's no neutrality in using these images.
No.
And I would say that goes for, work that interests me, certainly, is not neutral, or not kind of just giving just because it's beautiful to look at, or it has romance.
Yeah.
Certainly those horses for me, as the piece reveals itself, it's become more and more loaded with the historical.
Yeah.
Even though you're not putting it on them, but they, animals acquire these responsibilities.
Yeah.
It seems to me.
Yeah, I suppose the thing was like, they're definitely instrumentalized, but then I sort of tried to pare back to soften that instrumentalization. It's just with all the work that I make, there's always a politics. Like there's a politics at everything. That's a silly thing to say, but there's always a politics in there. But it's just the technique or the way that it's played out. I just think that there's a value in subtlety and a value in kind of complexity of trying to sort of find a way that doesn't break it down to being, to being like a polar situation, basically. Where there's a kind of acknowledgement of the complexity of situations, because all situations are complex. And so they try to kind of act in a subtle way, and the politics it never slaps you in the face. It's always something that I hope will kind of slowly emerge, basically, as you engage with the work. So it's about sort of pacing with it, I suppose.
And sound is a way of
dealing with that, I suppose. Yeah.
Have you always used sound and acoustics in your
No.
work? But you're always interested in music, or you have been singing.
Well, I've always been interested in music in the sense that it's like, I grew up in like the Midlands in the 70s. There wasn't a lot of art galleries around, but music is so democratic and fluid, and easy to access. Top of the Pops and the radio and all of those sort of things. So it's the first thing that you really encounter. Well, no, TV of course as well. So you develop a really great understanding about it. I was always in awe of it, and in awe of musicians and music, and it's always been really emotionally resonant for me. But it was only in my mid-20s when I started to play music, because I had my partner was a musician, and she sort of forced me a little bit to do it.
Okay.
And I'm still, and now I release lots of records, but I surround myself with very talented people to disguise my lack of talent, essentially. But it's probably it's the thing I'm most interested in. So in terms of things I read, it would be reading about music or musicology. Yeah, so it's kind of my main interest. I love art and I love making it, but in terms of thinking about the world, I find it a really nice vehicle to kind of think about the world.
I think awe. I'm also in awe. I grew up in a very musical family, but I can't sing, and they can all sing. So I'm fascinated with anybody who can just stand and open their mouth and just sing. To me that is a magical kind of a thing to be able to do.
Yeah.
And so I'm really drawn to the voice in that way, and how it's a tool of metamorphosis, really.
Yeah.
To me, But it's just staggering in awe of opera singers and people, or contemporary, like Amanda Galas. She's having a moment again, people are really visiting her work. People who are testing the boundaries, I suppose, of the sonic self.
Yeah.
To me, singing at that level, just pushes the body out into the world in a totally different way than, say, dance can do. Sound gets right in.
Yeah.
It gets into the chambers of the ear. It gets into the body.
Yeah. I suppose it was funny because we were Pork and I were driving up in the car, and we were talking about like stuff we liked and as teenagers, and how you would come upon music, basically, But we were talking about Top of the Pops and seeing the Smiths on Top of the Pops and how amazing and exotic it was as a thing. But they had a song on like it was a B-side of one of their 7-inches, basically, which was that song, which is Suffer Little Children. Do you know the song?
No.
So it's about Myra Hindley, who was the Moors murderer, and it was kind of controversial at the time, and it had an English actress that looked quite like her on the front cover, and wouldn't play it on British radio at all as a thing. But I basically heard the song and then knew there was something really interesting about the song, but didn't have the actual cultural reference. And then, as the news kind of revealed itself, it became apparent that the song was about that. But it was amazing in terms of the kind of dichotomy of things. The idea that somebody could be really like melancholic and beautiful without the context, and then with the context becoming more melancholic and beautiful. You know what I mean? More beautiful as a thing. But it was, for me, a really interesting kind of a pivotal starting point in terms of thinking about being an artist, probably. About thinking, wow, that's a really dynamic set of things occurring in that 1 3-minute piece of, these 4 people combining, basically. And it's interesting, I read a book about Mahler lately, Why Mahler, which is a really lovely book about Mahler. And so in lots of hospices, they play Mahler now. It's almost like a resignation kind of a piece where people really enjoy, like the Fifth Symphony in particular, basically, as a work. And and so the author of this book has this really interesting connection where he talks about Mahler being brought up, his parents owned a taverna, and he lost like 5 siblings as a child. And so the idea of these 2 things combining, this absolute tragedy, and then the bar wouldn't close, so he would be in a remarkably difficult emotional place, and then all the joviality and music would still occur downstairs. So for him as a child, this kind of understanding of humanity was like located in that paradox, the idea of these two things coexisting, that there could be joviality and it could be this like terrible sadness coexisting. And so this guy suggests that that's why Mahler's works are so meaningful, or why he understands emotion in a very particular way.
He does. I knew someone who wouldn't allow Mahler in the house.
No Mahler's on.
No, it's too much. It's exclusively for the concert hall.
Okay.
That was it.
Okay.
And not outside the door of the concert hall, because it was too powerful for her.
Sure.
So we were not allowed to bring any recordings in, or it was taboo. But speaking of recording, maybe we should get on to birds.
Oh yeah.
Which is the main course.
Yeah. Yeah.
As I say, birds and recording of birds, let's say.
Yeah.
I know you're interested in Messiaen. I write a bit about him.
You write very good stuff about him, yeah.
But I'm very interested in his collections of recordings of birds that he had sent to him when he couldn't travel. Friends sent him cassettes of birdsong from New Zealand and birds he had never heard, and he would write copious notes about them and describe them in wonderful ways. So his catalogue was interesting to me. His listening was such an important part of his world, and he had synesthesia, right?
Okay.
Do you have synesthesia?
No, I don't have synesthesia.
But isn't there some relationship with the thread work, sound and colour?
Well, there is not so much in that one, but in some of the works there are, where I play around with that idea of like making, Yeah, visual articulations of sound, but not in this instance, basically. So yeah.
Okay. So the sound recording that is in the main gallery here
Yes.
is your own?
Yeah, that's mine. That's actually the first time that I've done everything myself. So normally I would always be on the phone to Sean or Nina or somebody and leaning very heavily on them. And so that one was kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, again, it's really interesting in terms of what was more interesting about that project was actually Natalia was making recordings for me as well. But it's so difficult because the land is, so I was trying to get lots of bird song, hours and hours and hours of it. But our rural environment is so industrialized that it's really, really difficult to get like very clean sounds. And the better the microphone you have, the worse the sound, because it picks up all of the things that are far away as well. So it's like almost impossible to not have a car in a distance. Even at like, and even when there's lots of really rich birdsong around, it's usually when people are like planting or harvesting. So you can, even at like 4 o'clock in the morning, there's somebody who's starting to like take hay in or cut silage. So there's like a large industrial material, thing. So it was kind of interesting trying to get a pure sound, basically.
So how did you do it?
Well, just you basically find particular spots. So usually spots where there's a large expanse of water, basically. So you can get into like a forest where there's a large expanse of water around you. So there is farming, but it's beyond the water. So the water acts. It's there's a bridge, literally a bridge between you and them, basically. And then the works. Yeah, I suppose that's the other really interesting thing about sound is it's kind of about structured sound is its kind of function within ritual and ritual celebration, but ritual in general, basically. So I thought it'd be interesting to try and build it was to do with like the context as well. It was to do with the show being made for the Mac and the idea of how sound is used within like religious celebration and obviously the problematics and how the instrumentalization of religion within politics in Ireland and sort of trying to play with that, but again in a subtle way. So it wasn't going to be like, a marching band, but to try and play with that a bit. So I started doing lots of recordings in places of kind of ritual, basically. And then taking them and stripping them down and seeing if I could mimic something or if it would give me a trigger to go someplace with something, or some of them are just very subtle. So there's 2 of the pieces that are based on like a gospel choir in a local church where I just literally took 2 notes and dragged them and then copied and pasted them and played with them for like, in about like 40 layers, and that's all it is, basically. Again, it's
it's material that you've shaped.
Yeah, so again, but it's like it gets so removed that it's so subtle, it's almost invisible. So it becomes, and then it becomes a new kind of tonal kind of discussion, emotional discussion, I suppose, Yeah. And what about you and birdsong?
Well, I'm surrounded as well.
Where you live?
Where I am, yeah. Not so much at the moment now. It's seasonal, obviously.
Yeah.
But I suppose where I thread it is again looking to the artwork first, like Daniela Cacciavelli, that Italian artist who uses hunting whistles to make her sound performances. And so there's a thread for me between that kind of activity, capturing sound, capturing birds, hunting, and where so many of our relationships with non-human animal worlds are to do with hunting and eating them, and those relationships are so fundamental. And a lot of the tools that are created, even especially musical instruments, let's say, were for hunting, like the hunting horn, for example. There's a great piece on BBC Radio 3 recently there, just a short piece about the history of the hunting horn, and I don't really write about hunting horns, I do write about other kinds of horns that were religious, ritualized objects, but that then find their way into, I suppose there's a ritual aspect to the concert hall too,
Totally,
and the ritual of attending to art, you know, in that way. But certainly it's the hunting horn, you know, is the expression of, it's bringing the air of the forest into the concert hall. I like that idea, that it's bringing the air of outside in. And I think the bird is the same thing, you know, when Beethoven uses the bird, or it's using more contemporary, a lot of contemporary sound work. It's something about bringing the outside into an interior space and kind of exploding it.
Yeah, it was interesting because that place from ear to ear, I always thought that he'd used the finches because they're referred to, because like German woodsmen, right, would teach them. They kind of figured out that they're copying their songs, they're copying their folk songs, and which is really amazing, like that they have that potential, you know, and that they kind of figured it out. But then as soon as they figured out they could do it, the next thing they did was like try to make money off them, was to sell them basically.
That's right.
So and I thought it was really nice. So this piece of work we're talking about, everybody probably knows this work, but basically he sets up a whole load of guitars in a space with like
electric guitars
with pedals, and the birds just live there, and when they land on them they make lots of noise basically. But I thought it was kind of a kind of a play on that, the idea of like this commercialization of things. And yours is much more interesting and much more in depth in terms of you're breaking it down. But
of the finches
of that
themselves,
work,
yeah,
yeah,
how they're the most they're used in science, you know, and they're uniquely skilled at learning, yeah. But in his piece, from ear to ear, that just all crashes to the ground.
Totally,
I mean, because every time the little birds land on the guitars, there's this whack of, you know, guitar sound, and it's so contradictory, and it's such a sort of a celebration of sound, and the birds are really, I'm not sure how interested he is in birds, but he's a sound maker. You know, so he's used all kinds of things like trucks reversing. I know he's done epic work.
He's a lovely piece with bowls.
He does.
That's my favourite piece of his. Yeah. But yeah.
So
we're kind of out of time now.
We're getting a signal. Okay, we didn't get to the dessert.
No, we didn't get to dessert. What was dessert again?
The dessert was. Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about baby's breath.
Oh yes. Yes.
Because that's the vegetarian course. Baby's breath is gypsophilia, right? Yeah. And you have this kind of a meadow of this recreated in the gallery. Yeah.
Well, I suppose it's in some ways, it's like, I almost don't like talking about that work. When the first time I did and I went out in a video on the Mac, I was like a little embarrassed because I was like, oh, it was so clumsy. Because the work should be better than me. Should be better. It should have more scope than the way I can speak about it. But sorry, I'm digressing. But I suppose that whole room is about the idea of the kind of the earth resonating, I suppose, is a thing. So the shells are kind of play with this idea of the resonant shell, basically the idea of us, the earth being a shell, and we kind of hitting off it all the time. And the gypsophilia. Well, I always like. But Naomi, I always like umbellifers, like plants that grow in that way. But I like I've always liked the gypsophilia because it's always a bridesmaid.
It is.
It's always like the filler, basically. It's the background flower. It's never the showy offy one. And also it lasts for ages because the rest of them just die already. But it's kind of got this kind of toughness to it. So and then I love the idea of how we kind of project onto animals and plants this idea of, how we project. So the idea of it being like a baby's breath or being as soft as a baby's breath is a really beautiful kind of way to think about it. And then what happens when you put 300 of them in a room? What happens to the work then is kind of an interesting question.
Well, it's you arrive at resonance, really. And that's where I try to arrive as well. It's the same place. It's in a resonant consciousness. Really, and the consciousness of your breath. We're being brought back to that all the time.
Totally.
The sound of it, and and how essentially it's the core of your creatureliness in the world. It's being alive. That's what I think becoming is really.
Okay.
It's being.
Yeah.
Being alive, breathing, and sounding. You know. That's it.
That's a nice way to end.
Okay. We must talk
We will.
about becoming resonant landscapes.
I've just got one question about your book, and it's nothing to do with the insides of the book. On the cover,
Yes.
did you make the cover tactile on purpose?
No, I did not.
Okay.
I
'Cause it has an
had
interesting
very fixed ideas.
But you see when you feel it, it has a very
It is
interesting
very
feel.
nice, yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
I had very fixed ideas. I don't know about you. Well, we both trained as painters.
Yeah.
And very much, I live in images. Like everything is. So even writing, I'm thinking all the time. I was thinking what was going to be the cover of my book, you know. And I had very fixed ideas. But the Penn State, marvelous publishers, came back with three. They had their own ideas.
Okay.
And this was one which was really surprising to me. And the design is, he lives in New York, Henry Zene-Yi is his name, wonderful photographer actually. But he recorded himself speaking the title of the book.
Okay, that's where
Becoming Audible, Sounding Animal.
Okay.
So then this is the sound wave of his voice recording the sound.
Nice.
And he put it on top of this pony skin.
Okay, because the weird
surface,
thing is, the pony skin, it's obviously in my head that I felt tactile because it looks tactile. I'm so weird. But anyway, did you want to ask some questions of
Well, I just want to ask you about curating that exhibition.
these guys.
Just the idea of
Yeah.
the resonant landscape and how you...
Yeah, well, it's just a really interesting opportunity. So Sharon, so Porrick and I work together all the time. We're like, he's like totally sick of me. And Sharon, I've known for a long time now. I used to have a listening club in my studio in Dublin, a weekly listening club. And Sharon used to come along sometimes. And we knew each other before that even. Yeah. But Sharon's has done really great curatorial programs and is a really lovely writer and has written a very interesting PhD. And
about echoes. Right?
About echoes, yeah.
Right.
So it was kind of a no-brainer. I've always liked the things that she's put out in the world, and also then there's a project with my friend Sean and my best friend Carl. It's lots of ties in. And then Porrick is just a really great artist that doesn't get as much opportunity as he deserves, essentially. He's makes really amazing work all the time that no one gets to see. So he was a no-brainer. And Natalia and Willie do they have done lots of amazing things, organised festivals, and I think had a bookshop at one stage, and still do these remarkable events at their home and release really super interesting music by other people and in their own bands. So yeah, they're just people I knew who I thought would be interesting to engage.
I thought it was fascinating exhibition,
Yeah.
and it was a great resource as well.
Yeah, it's a really nice idea. Actually,
Yeah.
it's a really nice idea to have the scope to be able to invite people as part of your show. It was a really amazing thing.
Was Una going to close our lunch?
Thank you. Really stimulating and
Excellent.
really enjoyable as well. I remember when you did that recording of Tarzan, I was thinking, because of the Boyle connection here, of Maureen O'Sullivan, who famously starred in
Tarzan, really?
Tarzan, didn't we?
I don't
And
remember.
we have
She
this
was Jane.
gorgeous painting of said Maureen on a swing in Dublin. So anyway, that's nothing to do with resonance of sound.
And she's from Boyle, yeah?
Boyle, on the main, there in the
she's
main
on the
street,
street,
So thank you, such food
pleasure.
for thought. A gorgeous tasting menu, I thought. Really well put together. So the book has been launched, Austin.
Yes,
and thank you, Mark.
Oh, my
for the
pleasure.
Great kind of But the dynamic, I guess, that was there, what I was really interested in was that whole idea of you trying to record birdsong and the difficulty of it, you know, and that whole industrialization of the countryside, which I just would never have thought of, because I suppose I live in the city, so I don't hear those sounds except in a very pure form on radio, or when Mooney goes wild in May, or whatever he does, you know, one of those ones. So I'm always hearing a very purified, but sanitized. So it's not real. So we come to the end of your exhibition and of Resonant Landscapes. I had said to Sharon that last day when you were installing upstairs that we would mark it, and we would like to do that. So I'd hope you'd be able to stay on for a while and we can talk more. And thank you again. It was really lovely. We didn't have an opening. We haven't had any other events. So this was, I think, a really, really lovely one.
Thanks,
to finish
Una.
on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Una.
Thanks.
Thank you.